Hi, everyone. So this week we're going to be diving into Kantian Deontology. So Immanuel Kant, who lived between 1724 and 1804, was a German Enlightenment thinker. Deontology means duty. It's from the Greek deon. And that means that morality is grounded in duty rather than in consequences. So I want to emphasize here that consequences can still be important, but the main difference is that Kant believes that there is a right and a wrong, and that we should do the things that are right over the things that are wrong. And so he's not advocating that we should do something right because it produces the best consequences. He's advocating that we should do something right because it is right to do so. And we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go through the lecture. So by the end of this lecture, you should have a good understanding of some of the foundational principles of Kantian moral philosophy. You should be able to distinguish between the hypothetical and the categorical imperative. You should be able to explain views on goodwill and duty. And then you should be able to think about ideas of Kant and the Golden Rule. There have been some scholars that do not think that Kant's ideas were akin to the Golden Rule, and some scholars that believe we can make some comparisons to the Golden Rule. So we will critically evaluate Kantian ethics in this as a contrast to consequentialist and utilitarian theories. So let's talk about one of the key ideas, and that is that idea of goodwill. The only thing that is good without qualification is goodwill. That's what Kant will argue. And so unlike utilitarianism, Kant argues that moral worth lies in intention, not in the results. So goodwill means that the only intrinsically good thing, according to Kant, is goodwill. A person has moral worth if they act from a sense of duty, not merely in accordance with duty. For example, a shopkeeper who gives correct change because it's the right thing to do would be seen as acting in goodwill. It is not for profit or reputation that he gives back the correct change, or it's not because of the consequences that he's seeking. So we would be acting out of respect for moral law and doing what's right because it is right, regardless of what the desire that we have is or the outcomes. So Kantian morality is unconditional. You have to do your duty because it's your duty, not because you like it or it benefits you. So what is this idea of the hypothetical and the categorical imperative, and how does that work? So a hypothetical imperative commands that if you want X, then you do Y. It's based on a desire or a goal. An example would be, if you want to pass the test, then you should study. If you want to be healthy, then you should exercise regularly. The categorical imperative, however, is an unconditional moral law that applies to all rational beings, regardless of desire, regardless of individuality, regardless of culture, and you should only act on the maxim whereby you can at the same time make it a universal law. So we're going to be taking a look at what that means. The universal law theory means that you can test any of your actions against this universalizing principle. So, for example, lying to get out of trouble. If everyone did this, trust would break down, making lying impossible. So you can't universalize lying to get out of trouble. There is this humanity formula that means that you don't use people as instruments. For example, you don't befriend someone just to exploit them for their connections. So instead, you act out of respect for others. You act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means, never to get somewhere that's going to benefit you. So you act according to maxims that can universally be legislated by a moral community. So you might imagine yourself as a lawmaker in a just society where everyone follows the same moral law. Wow, what does that mean? How can everybody follow the same moral laws if things are culturally relative or morally, individually relative? So this is what calls Kant into question. But let's take a look at the golden rule versus the categorical imperative. So you probably saw some similarities of how we should treat people by using the categorical imperative to universalize things in a way that promises respect and human dignity. Act unto others as you would act towards yourself, as something that's similar to the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What you might not know is that there are literally hundreds of golden rules that are within all different religions, and they're basically sharing the same types of ideas, but some have some radical differences. So in the golden rule, you find that usually in Christianity and in some other world religions. It's based on a personal preference of how you would like to be treated. So something you might consider is that if you're using the golden rule in that way, you're acting on your own personal preferences, not necessarily the preferences that the person has. So your preferences might be different than the other person's preferences. So that could create some conflict. So in contrast, the categorical imperative is based on universal reason and not on personal feelings. So you should act from the principle that you could rationally will as a universal law, regardless of what you might personally want. So let's take a look at a couple of comparisons. The golden rule has a basis in empathy and preference. The categorical imperative has an emphasis or a basis in rational consistency. Is it conditional? Somewhat under the golden rule, but not under the categorical imperative. Is it problematic? Under the golden rule, you may be able to justify wrong actions if preferences are skewed. However, under a categorical imperative, it demands impartiality and logical coherence. So you can see we're going between sort of emotional and rational to contrast these ideas. So how can we apply Kantian ideas? Let's take a look at lying. In Kant's view, lying is always wrong. It's a categorical imperative. It violates the universal law. And so what this means is that we should not lie even if it's to save a life. Now, some people have said this is a really radical view, right? If somebody is in harm's way, of course you're going to lie in order to protect that person. And Kant's view was more extreme, so that it would fit into his categorical imperative and his ideas on that. How about charity? So doing good has moral worth, but only if it's done from duty. So you wouldn't do charity because of pity or because you wanted recognition. You would do it because you felt it was your duty to do so. Another practical application might be suicide. Suicide is wrong because it treats oneself as a means to an end, right? You want to escape suffering. And that is not a good idea. It's not good to have the end result be suicide so that you can escape your own suffering. Now, obviously, there are many controversial ideas, particularly when we get into discussing some things on euthanasia later in the class, and what we think about human dignity and suffering, whether or not we want to allow suffering to happen under certain circumstances. So many people, not all people, believe that suicide is wrong because it goes against the idea of preserving your life. And our most valuable deontological principle is the value of life principle. So all other principles go back to this idea on the value of life and preserving life and safety of another human being and of animals also and other things within our environment. However, we do value the idea that we don't want people to suffer unnecessarily in terms of like end of life applications, like people that are suffering from cancer and they're going to die and they're in hospice. Is it okay to end their lives in a compassionate way? And we usually see euthanasia in animals as being okay. We want to end their suffering, but it gets a little more complex when it comes to human suffering. So we'll dive into that also later on. So let's take a look at a few of the key strengths and weaknesses of Kantian ethics. So some of the strengths: it emphasizes a rationality, dignity, and human worth. It provides clear moral guidance for what we should do. It upholds moral equality and universal principles. So those are some good things about Kantian ethics. But as all theories, it has some weaknesses. It can lead to rigid or counterintuitive conclusions. Like we discussed before, it might not be a good idea to lie to the murderer at the door and tell you where the person is that they want to murder, right? We might not always tell the truth. It neglects consequences of actions, and it assumes that everyone has equal access to reason and moral understanding. Now, what that means is that some people might not have access to the same amount of reasoning as other people. For example, some people may be mentally challenged in particular ways in which they cannot access their moral reason. We also can apply this to children who aren't fully developed or haven't reached adulthood. Sometimes they don't have access to full reasoning capacities, so we have to make choices for them. So if you want to turn to your journal and do some reflections on Kantian philosophy, I have 3 key questions that you can think about this week as we dive into the material further. Number 1, should we always follow duty even when it causes harm? Number 2, is it ever morally acceptable to treat someone as a means to an end? See if you can think of any examples where that might work. And number 3, can we reconcile Kant's ethics with moral emotions like compassion? Remember, this is a very rational, reason-based theory that does not take into account emotions and feelings and compassion and empathy. So those are all things to reflect on as we move through our journey in Kantian deontology. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to our discussions.